We've got a great church family here. I love this church. I love the support that y'all give to each other, and it is very meaningful to me um, to have a church family that cares about the victories, about the difficulties, about the losses, and all the rest. It's a very comfortable place to be. But now that I know that Casey, a trained Christian counselor, is going to be at the anxiety thing on Wednesday nights, now I am anxious. Uh, but really, when we come, the discussion is really kind of nice and full, and I hope that you'll give it a try if you have not come on a Wednesday night before. Uh, we've been in this little series on wisdom, and today we're just going to be talking about choosing wisdom. And I heard recently this story of a mom in the rough neighborhood of the West Side in Chicago. And back in 1966, she's raised in a family of 9 siblings by herself. 7 of them are boys, and she says they were always stretching to the boundary, to the breaking point, the limits of her patience and authority. And then one morning, she gets this knock on the door, and she discovers out on her front stoop 25 thugs. They were members of a notorious gang in the area, and they'd all come to her house to recruit her 7 boys. And they told her that much. So she hung her head and said, "Oh no." And she said, "Give me just a moment." She closed the door, went back into the house, and the first thing that those gang members saw when she came out was the barrel of a loaded shotgun. And she said to them, "There's only one gang around here, and that's the Thomas gang." And they all took off. Now, I love that story because it comes from Isaiah Thomas. He was the youngest of the 7 boys in that family, and you might remember him, all-star NBA player and all the rest. And I appreciate that story because sometimes, and this is just going to be chills, sometimes as parents, and sometimes really as mamas, what we need is Mama Bear, who comes out on the front porch, fights for her kids with a loaded shotgun. I love that image because when the Proverbs are written, the sages who are inspired by God, when it comes to talking about wisdom or picturing wisdom, wisdom is pictured essentially as a woman, and as a woman who really fights for her kids, which is entirely appropriate. And we're going to see that here in Proverbs chapter 9, verses 1 through 6. Let's go ahead and stand out of respect for God, who's speaking to us through his word. Wisdom has built her house. She has hewn her 7 pillars. She has slaughtered her beasts. She has mixed her wine. She has also set her table. She has sent out her young women to call from the highest places in town. "Whoever is simple, let him turn in here. To him who lacks sense," she says, "come, eat of my bread and drink of the wine I have mixed. Leave your simple ways and live and walk in the way of insight." And now it's time to hear from woman Folly. The woman Folly is loud. She is seductive and knows nothing. She sits at the door of her house. She takes a seat on the highest places of the town, calling to those who pass by, who are going straight on their way. "Whoever is simple, let him turn in here." And to him who lacks sense, she says, "Stolen water is sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant." But he does not know that the dead are there, that her guests are in the depths of Sheol. May God bless the reading of his word. You may have been seated. Now, we've been talking about wisdom, and we've seen that a good biblical understanding of wisdom is knowing how things really happen, knowing how things really are, and then knowing what to do about it. And last week, we kind of focused on the reason wisdom works. You see, the sages believed that wisdom pre-existed the world and that the world came to be through wisdom, that wisdom made the world and frolicked over the creation, including the creation of humankind. That's right there in Proverbs chapter 8, verses 22 through 31. And so we know that wisdom works because since God created the world according to wisdom, there is a fabric and a pattern to all of reality that wisdom understands. And then we started talking about, since there is a pattern to reality, we need to know that, but we also need to know that we can't see the whole of the pattern of reality. And so no one should be wise in their own eyes. That's Proverbs chapter 3, verse 7. We should not be wise in our own eyes, thinking that we know the whole of the pattern. And so since we recognize there's a pattern, and since we recognize we don't know the whole of the pattern, what we need are wise guides who maybe have been walking the path of wisdom longer than us. And so traditionally, we've had people who are older, and we've had a community that helps us to grow in wisdom because we need guides. And yet the reality is, the greatest guide of all is wisdom herself. Because in the Bible, wisdom isn't just a concept. It's not just a way of living. Wisdom is actually a person. And so what we've talked about last week is how Jesus Christ was seen by the New Testament writers as Lady Wisdom. I know that sounds strange as we're mixing, genders or something like this, but in the New Testament, the writers and Jesus himself saw Jesus as wisdom. And we spent some time on some scriptures there. Here's another one that we didn't even bring up. This is over in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 24. It talks about Christ, the wisdom of God. Now, I know that all of this, and that's pretty much, if you missed last week, we kind of caught you up to speed. I know that for some people, this gets a little strange. Okay, wisdom pre-exists. Wisdom creates the world. Wisdom is not just a concept, but is a person. This sounds all Lord of the Rings-esque and all the rest. But the reality is when you look at the New Testament and you look at the book of Proverbs, what you see is that Christ is the wisdom of God that you can see and you can know. And this is actually very practically helpful. And this is why I do encourage people, if you've never read, especially the New Testament or the Gospels, read them. If you've never read a book about Jesus Christ, read it. When you get into the actions of Jesus and the words of Jesus, the reactions, the responses of Jesus, you're kind of shocked. And the shock is of somebody who's seeing, maybe for the first time, the perfect person. And I have chills on this because even when people are anti-Christian or anti-Bible or anti-church and all the rest, even in our culture, people are pro-Jesus. Because as you read through the Gospels and you study who Jesus is and how he responds, you just go, wow, this is amazing. Here's somebody that just doesn't seem to be, you couldn't make this guy up. He is the ultimate argument for the existence of God, only he's not an argument. He's a person. Now, I have a philosophy background, and so I kind of got into this stuff. And when I was younger, I was in Christian apologetics. Then I went to school and I majored in philosophy. And sometimes people might come and ask or say something like, hey, Ernest, if you could just give me the airtight argument for the existence of God, if you Christians could do that, then I would believe. Well, I know some good arguments, and they've compelled some people over the centuries and at least over the decades. I know some arguments. But let me just ask you, honestly, if the airtight argument for the existence of God were presented to you, do you have the brilliance and do you have the existential, neutrality in order to judge the argument as being actually airtight? Now you say, well, Ernest, you don't understand. I am brilliant. I've got 180 IQ, and I'm perfectly neutral, and I'm going to judge things, and I'm not going to be biased. Okay, great. But since you are so brilliant and unbiased, you probably know that everybody else is not as brilliant and as unbiased as you are, right? So wouldn't it be great if God, instead of presenting to you and to me the ultimate argument for the existence of God, wouldn't it be great if God just presented the airtight person? Because the airtight person is accessible to everybody. The airtight person can be known by the brilliant and by the not so brilliant, the old and the young, male and female, regardless of race or background. The airtight person is accessible to everybody because he's a person. Now, I want to press it, and if God did take that approach where wisdom were a person and wisdom became flesh and made his dwelling among us, Wouldn't that be supremely wise of God to make himself thoroughly accessible as the airtight person? I want to press into this for just a second because I think sometimes we don't quite get this. I think that, this is kind of interesting to me. There is an airtight argument in the realm of theoretical mathematics that seems to defy intuition and general expectations, but it is an airtight proof. It's an airtight argument. So you may have heard of this. It's the Banach-Tarski paradox. How many of you ever heard of that? Oh, well, I'm going to teach you something today. The Banach-Tarski paradox proves that a solid three-dimensional sphere can be cut into a finite number of pieces and reassembled into two identical copies of the original sphere, same shape, size, and volume. Now, if I've already lost you, okay. It took me about 10 times to read over that to even figure out what the paradox was, but apparently there's an airtight proof. So if you go to Wikipedia, and see, that's the picture of it. You can take one thing, transfer it to two things equal size, and it can be done. You say, how is that possible? Well, read about the paradox. So when you go to Wikipedia, it gives you the proofs. Here's what it says. Here's a proof sketch that is similar but not identical to that given by Banach and Tarski. Essentially, the paradox decomposition of the ball is achieved in 4 steps. 1, find a paradoxical decomposition of the free group in 2 generators. 2, find a group of rotations in 3D space isomorphic to the free group in 2 generators. 4, use the paradoxical decomposition of that group and the axiom of choice to produce a paradoxical decomposition of the hollow unit sphere. And then finally, extend this decomposition to the sphere to a decomposition of the solid unit ball. And so after I read that, I go, oh, now I get it. Okay, I've got it. This is perfectly compelling. I see. No, actually, that's not what happened. And then I read some of the mathematical language that followed that proved all the different steps. And it occurred to me, there may be only 100 people on the face of the planet who understand the paradox or the proofs to the paradox. But let's suppose, for argument's sake, that 1 million people, there's 8.3 billion people on the face of the planet, that's 8,300,000,000. Let's suppose 1 million people understand the paradox and the proof, and they go, oh, this is compelling. This is true. I am one of 8,299,000,000 who don't understand any of this at all. You know what that means? That means that all the proofs in the world are not compelling to me because I don't have the brilliance or some preset knowledge in order to understand what is being talked about here. Okay, now the reason I bring this up is to say, look, God brilliantly did not give us the airtight argument because not everybody is brilliant enough to understand the airtight argument, even if it was there, and we frankly don't have, the non-bias of the soul in order to receive it, even if it were true. God in his brilliance, though, he gives us the airtight person. And that just gives me chills because God's not a snob. God is passionate even for those who are moving away from him, which, according to the Bible, would actually be all of us. He's passionate for the weak in mind or the feeble of soul or for those who are running. He just makes himself undeniably there in the airtight person who is Jesus, the wisdom of God become flesh among us. I think that's a beautiful concept to me. That he's that passionate, that he didn't just send something at a distance or a formula, that he personally showed up for you and for me, knowing that even though he was the airtight person and no one could find fault with him, they were going to crucify him anyways. That's the wisdom of God. And it's kind of the wisdom that we remember today. It's a sacrificial wisdom, but we'll get to that in a second. The second thing I really kind of want you to notice here or take to heart is that Jesus is the wisdom of God who is with you. That is to say, Jesus, the wisdom of God, doesn't sit on high and then call out our ignorance from a distance or say, got you, or that was dumb. He's actually present with you and with me in a very personal way. It's kind of like the story of the guy who goes out on the ice, cuts a hole in it, starts fishing. He hears a voice from above. There are no fish under the ice. This young man ignores it, moves to another section, cuts a hole in the ice, throws his line in, starts fishing again. And once again, he hears the voice. There are no fish under the ice. Now he can't ignore the voice, and he looks up and he says, Lord, is that you? And the man says, no, I'm just the manager of the rink up in the sound booth. God doesn't sit up there going, that was dumb, don't do that, stop. No, he's actually with us, guiding us in a very personal way. The other thing that we notice here as we're putting all this together is Jesus is the wisdom of God sacrificing for you. And we actually see the sacrificing happening in a way that isn't immediately obvious, but it's actually there in Proverbs chapter 9, verses 1 through 6. In that particular passage, what you have is wisdom building her house. It says that wisdom has built her house. She has hewn her 7 pillars. Now, 4 pillars would be enough. 7 pillars is a number of completion. In other words, when you walk into the house into which wisdom invites you, it's not going to cave in on you. And then what you get there is a feast that is prepared for you. She butchers the animal. She prepares the whole feast. It's not just, lame bread and stolen water. It's quite the feast. And then after she's prepared the feast, and after the house is constructed, and after the table's set and everything's ready, then she goes out and she starts inviting and bringing in. And all of this is free of charge. It's completely paid for by her sacrifice, by her work, by her grace. Okay, does that remind you of anybody? He goes to prepare a place for you, and the feast that's set before us, it's not a cheap feast, because what we eat is nothing less than his broken body. The wine that's poured out is nothing less than his blood, his holy blood for you and for me. It's entirely paid for. There's a sacrificial nature, is what I'm trying to get at, in terms of wisdom who is calling out. And so I want you to notice this. The invitation of wisdom is thoroughly personal, because wisdom is a person who's on your side. And so when James writes rather famously, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault. It will be given to you. You've got to see Jesus Christ in the center of all of that. And then finally, one more point I need to make here, and we're going to hang out on this for just the rest of the message, is this. Jesus is the wisdom of God aggressively reaching out to you. You'll notice that wisdom is calling out. It says, wisdom has sent her young women to call from the highest places in town. Whoever is simple, let him turn in here. There's an aggressive outreach program. Okay, wisdom is not content to allow the simple to go on their way. Wisdom goes chasing after and calling after the simple. In fact, wisdom even recruits women to help with the call. Folly doesn't have to recruit. Folly does it all on her own, because people naturally move towards folly, but people are naturally moving against wisdom, which is why wisdom is all the more concerned about recruiting other people to help her in a program. So here's kind of the question. Why does wisdom have to be so aggressive in her invitation? And at least part of the answer is this. Because wisdom is not the only woman aggressively reaching out to the simple. There's another voice that's calling, okay? There's a rival invitation. And the rival invitation is constantly coming at you and at me and at our families. Let's go back to verses 13 through 17. The woman folly is loud. She is seductive and knows nothing. She sits at the door of her house. She takes a seat on the highest places of the town, calling to those who pass by, who are going straight on their way. Whoever is simple, let him turn in here. And to him who lacks sense, she says, stolen water is sweet and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. But he does not know that the dead are there, that her guests are in the depths of Sheol. Why do we need wisdom? Because there is a rival invitation, and it is strikingly similar to the invitation that wisdom gives us. I mean, look at woman folly and you look at lady wisdom. They both have offers. They both make promises. In fact, they both sound the same on the front end. They're saying the same thing. Whoever is simple. Let him turn in here. On the surface of things, the call seems pretty similar, but that's where the similarities end, only on the surface of things, because the differences between them are actually thoroughly massive, and the endpoints are thoroughly different. For starters, it says that she knows nothing, which I got to thinking about this. Wisdom is the Sergeant Schultz of the Old Testament. I know nothing. And that word nothing is the same root as the word simple, which means the simple and folly, they actually naturally kind of match up. Because you would wonder, why is folly so seductive, but wisdom isn't seductive? Because in the end, all wisdom offers is some stale bread and stolen water. Why would anybody be attracted to that? You could have the solid house that's not going to fall in on you. You can have the feast, and it's all free, and it's not water, it's wine. Why would you choose folly over wisdom? Why is folly so seductive? Well, the reason is she doesn't come with what wisdom brings, which is correction and discipline and facing reality. And that's what makes folly attractive. Because who is it that the simple are? The simple are essentially those who are undecided. The simple are the people who are constantly listening to, folly on one shoulder and wisdom on the other, or, the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other, however it is. They're constantly undecided. They want to keep their options open. They want to be, free-floating and make their own decisions. And of course, the problem with all of that, in terms of, I'm just going to treat wisdom as a consultant and I'm going to make my own choices. The problem with always remaining open is that you remain in the driver's seat, and that's the essence of foolishness. People will remain undecided because that's the way we can stay in the driver's seat of our lives. But the simple are not wise simply because they are interested in keeping their options open and doing their own thing and making up their own minds. And I'm not saying you can't make up your own mind, but there's a call at a certain point to leave your simple ways, to kind of make a decision. Okay, let me put it like this. I knew a person who, whenever maybe she felt like a little conflicted about a decision, she would ask for opinions of other people. And she'd ask for 50 different people to give their opinion on what she needed to do. And the reason she asked so many people for their opinion is she was always looking for the one input that would confirm what she already wanted to do. Making up my own mind, but pretending like I'm actually getting consulting, but I'm staying in the driver's seat. That is biblically what foolishness is. I had quoted this earlier. I didn't put it up on the screen. It's Proverbs chapter 3, verse 7, that no one should be wise in their own eyes, but instead of being wise in their own eyes and making your own decisions, you should fear the Lord and hate evil. That's the contrast. If the Lord is only your consultant but not your master, if wisdom is only your consultant but not your master, then you're in the driver's seat, and that makes you fundamentally foolish because you're treating wisdom as something that it's not, a consultant instead of your master. And so the simple continually will gravitate toward folly because the same nothing is at the bottom of all of this. Okay, let me put it like this. Have you ever noticed that when you make up your mind, or you make your own decisions and you make your own rules, you decide things for yourself, have you noticed that if you keep doing that all the time and you're not really following wisdom, that the more you make decisions for yourself, the more you start thinking that all your decisions are right because you were the one that was making them? And the more you become prone to not receiving input outside of your own thinking, and that means you're not correctable, and that means that you become more and more of a fool. Which is why Proverbs also has wisdom saying, leave your simple ways and live. Stop doing this. It's a little reminiscent of verses 7 and 8, which I kind of skipped over, but I'll get to, which is where the person is making up their own mind. They're becoming more and more of a fool because they're refusing correction, and they're staying in the driver's seat, and they become the scoffer. Whoever corrects a scoffer gets himself abused, and he who reproves a wicked man incurs injury. Do not reprove a scoffer, and he'll hate you. Reprove a wise man, and he will love you. I'm going to put a statement up there. I want you to take notes if you're writing this down because it might take you a while to meditate on this one. The simple do not stay undecided. They want to stay undecided. But the simple don't stay undecided forever because they become, by their choices, the end of their path one step at a time. I'll read that again. The simple do not stay undecided. They want to stay undecided, but they don't stay undecided forever because they become, by their choices, the end of their path one step at a time. That is to say, the end isn't just a place, it's a condition of the soul. Or put a little bit differently, people can stray into the territory of the grave before they even get there. Okay. In the book of Proverbs, there's a lot of talk about life and death, but there's not much talk about the afterlife. What's being communicated in the book of Proverbs is you can live and find life, or you can live and find death, but death comes before you actually get there. Okay. So in Proverbs chapter 9, verse 18, when it talks about those who go into the house of folly and those who feast at the table of folly, well, their company are the dead and those who are in Sheol. That's not saying that when you're foolish, you die immediately. It doesn't help to be foolish. But what is being communicated is this. You go into the house of folly and you just continue on your simple ways and you wind up in that house, you will live, but you'll miss life. And consequently, when you miss life, you're going to be in that situation where you've strayed into the territory of the grave. It's like the walking dead before you even get there. You've made choice after choice after choice of being undecided until you fundamentally not just wound up in the place of fools, but you fundamentally adopted this condition of being a fool. I like to always remain open to God doing miracles in people's lives because every conversion is a miracle, and we see that in the book of Acts. That's why we spent so much time there. But the reality is, there does come a point where people stay in the driver's seat and stay in the driver's seat and stay in the driver's seat, and they're moving toward the path of folly, and they think they're in the driver's seat, but they've been in that driver's seat of themselves so long that they're not driving anything. They're being driven by folly. Now, I know I've just thrown out a whole lot of heavy stuff here, but it's all there in the book of Proverbs. So let me give you some very, very practical takeaways. And the first one is this. Jesus Christ, the wisdom of God, and those he's sent out to call from the highest places in the town must be intentional about reaching out to the undecided. You see, the simple don't just naturally gravitate toward wisdom. The simple naturally gravitate toward foolishness. I wish everybody, if you've never if you've never taken the chance to come over here to the Sunday school class, we've got a new motto here: tear down those walls. We want to grow so that we expand that classroom. We were just now today talking about Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 through 10, and just the reality that we only come to Christ because by the sheer powerful grace of God, he reaches out to us even when we're dead in our sins and transgressions. He just reaches out to us and pulls them to himself. This is resonating with the book of Proverbs. What that means is you can't just let people go on their own way, because to leave the simple alone is to leave the simple to rot. We have to be active in the pursuit and the calling out to the simple. Now, again, I'm saying undecided. I'm not saying simple mind. I'm not saying stupid. That's not the word. Those who've yet decided. So let me just kind of drive this home with regards to children and youth. Because on the whole, children and youth are at that point where they're choosing one path or the other. We know this. Statistically, when it comes to people coming to Christ, 90% have done so at the age of 18 or earlier. Those are the formative open, opportune moments. So let's just talk about this for just a second. Parents, your children need you to be the parents. Okay, I'm not picking on anybody here because I think we actually have very wise parents. So let me just reinforce what you're doing. Your children need you to be the parents. Your children may want you on occasion to just kind of hang out and chill and relax and be the buddy and all the rest. And there's a time and a place for that, and it comes when they enter into their 30s. But for now, when they're in the home, okay, they sometimes just need Mama Bear to step out on the front porch with the shotgun and run off the fools. And dads, they need you to be present and, keep the big boy pants on and, lead in the household. And kids need teachers who are going to teach and challenge and on occasion give bad grades. And they need coaches that are going to teach the kids to fight and get back up when they've been punched in the mouth by reality. Children can't just be left alone and it'll all work out. Because remember, there are these competing invitations. And I get chills because this just terrifies me. It'll all work out. And we're not going to police their social media. You're not going to oversee, what they're watching, what they're seeing, what's popping up, and no control. It'll just work out, and I'm just going to be their buddy. It's like, you do know that Lady Folly is seductive, and our hearts are pulled in this direction. And I'm not picking on kids because I actually remember what hormones were like. It's a terrifying place, and wisdom has to call out, with a certain passion, because you're not the only woman after your kids. Okay? And kids that are just kind of left on their own out in the wilderness when they're raised by wolves, they just don't have a tendency to become good shepherds on their own. Okay? So there's a passion. Among other things, that means praying with a passion for your kids. That means being participants with regards to the kingdom of God and leading by example. That means participating in the family of God that He has brought you to. And that means as grandparents or just community members, that means supporting, Evan and Audrey and this church family with regards to, reaching out and making disciples. Okay? We've got to be passionate because wisdom is not as attractive as foolishness, and the voices of folly are excessive in our culture. You know this. Just a reminder. There's one other thing I think we need to recognize, and that is we need to take the task of calling out seriously because the voice of folly, as I've just mentioned, is as pervasive, seductive, and as empty as ever. Last year, there was a curious trend that popped up where people would ask ChatGPT, hey, if you were the devil and you wanted to destroy the next generation, how would you do it without people recognizing? Y'all hear about that trend? All kinds of interesting responses. Responses would come back like this. This is from ChatGPT. I wouldn't come with violence. I'd come with convenience. I'd keep them busy, always distracted. They'd never know it was me. They'd call it freedom. Now, social psychologist Jonathan Haidt had been tracking the mental health of Gen Z kind of going off a cliff, really starting in 2012, which is when iPhones, mobile phones, and social media just became almost nearly completely universal. And he says he'd seen this sort of thing happening among Gen Z, and so he asked ChatGPT this question, and ChatGPT came back with a 7-step response on how to destroy the next generation. And it all started with this step. If young people can't focus deeply, they can't learn, create, or love. The subtle trap is to addict them to constant stimulation, endless scrolling, notifications, microbursts of dopamine. They'll feel busy, connected, even informed, while in reality, their capacity of sustained thought and presence erodes. They won't know what they've lost. Now, Haidt said this is exactly what he watched unfold over the years that he'd been examining Gen Z, and he was especially concerned because he said, I'm noticing the erosion of certain human capacities for wisdom, purpose, creativity, love. And the master stroke of this whole devilish plan, if you will, is captured in this statement. Not by violence, but by distraction, disconnection, and erosion of meaning. They wouldn't even notice because it would feel like freedom and entertainment, right? How pervasive, how empty, okay, how seductive. Now, recently I saw my son, and he was talking about how even like when he goes to the Disney Channel, because he's got like a grandson and a granddaughter and concerned about all these things wisely because I imparted wisdom, and wisely because I did stupid things. He says the thing he remembers, and this is the thing they brought up. He wasn't trying to dog on me. I told you I was going to give you some dirt. Here it is. He said, "Dad, I was too young when we watched Arachnophobia, and like so I'm scared of spiders. In fact, he said I remember spitting out my binky. I don't know that he was that young, okay, but Dad, we got to be more careful with our social media or TV and all the rest. So it's like he doesn't even want to get on the TV because when you're streaming and you go to the Disney Channel, you got all this junk that immediately shows up, and you got all these weird ads. And he says, I don't even want to do that. I just want to have like a Blu-ray player, and we're going to have monitor stuff. Like, good for you, being extra careful. But it's getting even harder and harder to be careful. It really is. I came across this as a Wall Street Journal article. It was back in March of this year, earlier this year, and a question was asked to some people who kind of know some things. What do you think media is going to be like 20 years from now? And tell us the future of entertainment. That was like 2046, what's entertainment going to be like? And the responses are downright surreal. Dimitri Gallegos wrote, one person described playing video games controlled entirely by thought. Another imagined gathering with friends for virtual reality experiences like skiing or traveling without ever leaving the room. Someone else pictured a world where people live inside hyper-personalized imaginary worlds. Artificial intelligence would build continuous storylines where you are the main character. One respondent even joked that humans might end up attached to feeding tubes and neuropods while being endlessly entertained by AI masters. It did not feel entirely like a joke. Perhaps the most telling comment predicted that the algorithms already causing you to waste hours scrolling today will become far more powerful. That is where culture is heading. And the culture, it seems, is being manipulated by what the Bible would define as fools. Now, I'm not anti all of this stuff. My wife and I, we got a nice TV that was, glare free and all the rest. Now we got to return it, and like, well, it's how much it's going to cost, and I don't know. And we want the high resolution, this and that. We're all about the tech, and maybe there's some good uses for AI. I'm not dogging on all this stuff like, ooh, terrible, terrible. But what we're talking about here is not temporary distraction. What we're talking about is the fundamental undermining of just attending to God and people and reality. What we're talking about is moving in a direction where our culture is strengthening our narcissism and escape from reality. And to me, it's kind of bothersome that we just kind of, I don't know, it'll work out. No. Lady Folly cries out with a seductive voice. And people are not inclined to go in these directions. So just a reminder, you're fighting for your kids. And we're fighting for your kids. And we're all wanting to fight together for our kids. And that's why we're supportive, not just of our kids' ministry and children's ministry, but of Jen Hartman and Young Life, and why we're passionate about what's going on in the schools and for our teachers and coaches. Because as it is right now, according to the experts, we're kind of losing the next generation. And this is coming from non-believers. So let's be passionate about our prayers, passionate in our commitment to Jesus, passionate in terms of our giving of our time and talents and resources. Let's be passionate about our obedience to God in every way, shape, or form. We need to be passionate about advancing the kingdom of light because the prince of foolishness is on the move and he's going full throttle. Let's bow for a word of prayer. God, help us to be serious-minded about advancing wisdom. And Lord, we can't help but think that you were absolutely serious-minded about it because even while we were still sinners or even while we were still fools, you became flesh, you made your dwelling among us, and you did more than that. You allowed yourself to be crucified for the likes of us. We did not deserve you coming to us, but wisely you did, but in love, because you knew there was no other way whereby we could be saved except for you coming to us and doing what it is that you did to draw us to yourself. And it's all completely by your grace. You've paid for everything. And so, Lord, in light of what you've done for us, help us, Lord, to join in on your team, in your endeavor, in calling out from the high places to the simple who are on their way toward destruction. Show us where we need to make adjustments. Show us where we need to become a little bit more intent and prayerful. Suppose, Lord, the world has always been inclined toward foolishness, but sometimes the foolishness rears its ugly head in ways that are more obvious than others. So give us a passion for your kingdom, a passion for this church, a passion for our children, and may it show up in the way that we participate and watch and guide and direct our children and the kids of this community. Lord, I don't know what else to ask. I just know there's a lot at stake. Thank you for the reminder. And thank you, Lord, for the body that was broken, the blood that was shed. Thank you for the table that you set for us. Thank you for inviting us into the house. May we invite even more. And we pray that in Jesus' blessed holy name. Amen.